Cowboy defeated her mate in combat. By tribal custom, she became his concubine and chose to stay. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The San Juan Basin in 1876 offered little margin for error, and Samuel Ridge knew that before his boots touched the gravel near the water source he had been tracking since morning. He had been riding since first light, moving cattle along a narrow route he used every season to avoid towns and patrols, his purpose practical and limited to keeping his herd alive long enough to reach safer grazing. He was 41, lean from years of labor rather than design, with a face shaped by sun and wind and a posture that reflected long habits of caution. He had left Army service years earlier after refusing orders that resulted in civilian harm, and since then his work as a drover kept him alone by choice, not comfort, moving between places without staying long enough to be known. Water mattered more than speed, and this source sat at the edge of contested ground, used by different groups depending on season and pressure, which meant every approach required attention. Samuel dismounted carefully, loosening his horse's reins just enough to keep the animal calm, his eyes checking the ridge lines and brush without panic, only awareness. He set his rifle against a rock, crouched, and filled his canteen with controlled movements, the kind that came from experience rather than fear, though the tension in his shoulders never fully eased. He heard the footstep behind him before he sensed the presence, the sound placed deliberately on stone, close enough to register as a warning rather than a mistake. His first reaction was restraint, not alarm, because sudden movement had ended more lives than hesitation ever had. He straightened slowly and turned, his hands empty, his body squared but neutral, preparing to speak without knowing if words would be useful. The Apache warrior stood a short distance away, balanced and still, his gaze fixed, his expression closed. He carried himself with certainty that came from belonging to the land rather than claiming it, and Samuel understood immediately that this was not a misunderstanding that could be explained away. The man's presence marked a boundary, and Samuel's own position marked a violation, intentional or not. Samuel spoke, keeping his voice steady, explaining his need, offering to move on once his canteen was filled, his thoughts racing through options that narrowed by the second. He did not want to fight. He did not want to prove anything. His priority was survival, his own and his herd's, and leaving this place intact. The words did not shift the man's stance. A single step forward closed the space, and that movement ended the possibility of resolution. The struggle began without flourish, driven by proximity and instinct, hands locking on his sleeves and forearms, weight shifting as boots slipped against damp stone. Samuel felt the impact more than he saw it, his focus narrowing to balance and leverage, aware of pain but not yet its source. The encounter was brief, shaped by momentum rather than intent, and when it ended the warrior lay motionless near the water's edge. Samuel stepped back, his breath uneven, a cut above his eye bleeding into his vision, his hands trembling despite his effort to steady them. Shock set in before relief could form, his thoughts fragmented by the speed of what had happened. He did not feel victory. He felt the weight of consequence, immediate and permanent, settling in his chest. He did not look down again, knowing the sight would not change the outcome. Then he noticed her. She stood above the ravine, partially shielded by rock, her posture rigid, her face composed in a way that suggested discipline rather than detachment. She did not move toward the fallen man or cry out. Her eyes tracked the scene with a controlled focus that made Samuel uneasy, not because of accusation, but because of what he could not read there. He understood she was connected to the man on the ground, not by assumption, but by the way she held herself, and the realization tightened something in his chest that had nothing to do with injury. Other Apache men appeared briefly, gathering the body without confrontation, their decision shaped by the risk of escalation rather than emotion. They did not address Samuel. No threats were made. They withdrew into the basin's scrub as the light began to fade, leaving the space altered and quiet again. She did not follow them. Samuel packed his gear with deliberate care, his mind working through the implications without clarity. He mounted his horse, aware of the pain settling into his muscles, and rode out at a measured pace, not signaling for her to follow or leave. After several minutes, he heard footsteps behind him, steady and controlled, keeping distance without retreat. He did not turn. He did not need to. By the time the sun dropped lower and the shadows stretched across the basin, Samuel understood that the encounter at the water source had created an obligation he did not yet comprehend, binding him to a woman whose presence carried grief, restraint, and a law he had never been taught, and that whatever came next would require decisions he could not avoid by riding away. They traveled until the light began to thin, the basin stretching wide and empty around them, and Samuel kept his pace measured so his horse would not show strain or urgency. He did not acknowledge her presence directly, but he adjusted his route to follow open ground where visibility stayed clear, a decision shaped by habit rather than courtesy. Every few minutes he evaluated his surroundings, listening for movement that did not belong, aware that the earlier encounter might draw consequences even if no one had followed. Behind him, Nalin walked with steady rhythm, neither rushing to close the distance nor lagging far enough to suggest reluctance. She carried no visible weapon, only a small bundle secured at her side, and Samuel noted how she conserved energy, stepping where footing was firm, avoiding loose gravel without hesitation. She showed no signs of collapse or shock, and that unsettled him more than panic would have, because it suggested she was still functioning within a structure he could not see. As dusk settled, Samuel chose a low rise near a stand of scrub where wind was minimal and the ground offered enough cover to build a fire without drawing attention. He dismounted, tied his horse, and moved through the familiar sequence of establishing camp, each action deliberate and controlled. He placed his rifle within reach, but did not keep it in his hands, a choice made as much for his own restraint as for any signal it might send. He set a portion of dried meat and bread on a flat stone away from his bedroll, then stepped back without comment. His thoughts stayed practical, focused on preventing misunderstanding through distance rather than explanation. When he turned away to gather brush, he heard the quiet sound of movement and knew she had accepted the food. He did not watch her eat. Night fell quickly, the temperature dropping enough to stiffen his joints, and Samuel felt the ache from the earlier struggle settle deeper into his muscles. He sat near the fire, warming his hands, his eyes fixed on the edge of the light where darkness pressed close. He considered his options without illusion. Sending her away would expose her to risks he understood too well. Taking responsibility without clarity felt dangerous in a different way. Neither option offered certainty, and avoidance was no longer possible. Nalin remained across the fire, her posture upright, her attention moving between the surrounding land and Samuel's movements. She did not sleep immediately. She did not speak. At one point, she shifted closer to the fire, adjusting her position to stay warm without crossing into his space, and Samuel noted the calculation in the movement. She was not waiting for permission. She was assessing safety. He slept lightly, waking at intervals, his hand resting near his rifle more from reflex than fear. Each time he stirred, he confirmed her position had not changed. She stayed alert through most of the night, her presence steady and unprovocative, and by morning Samuel recognized that she had been guarding the perimeter from the opposite side of the fire, not for him, but because vigilance was habit. At first light, Samuel rose and checked his horse, then packed his gear without hurry. He gestured toward the open ground ahead, indicating the direction he intended to travel, and waited without expectation. Nalin stood, adjusted the bundle at her side, and followed at the same distance as before. As they moved on, Samuel felt the weight of the previous day settle into a clearer understanding. Whatever rule had placed her in his path had not forced submission or obedience. It had placed responsibility on him without explanation, and he would have to decide what that meant before someone else did. The cabin came into view late in the afternoon, sitting low against the uneven ground as if it had learned not to draw attention to itself, its weathered boards dulled by sun and grit, its position chosen for function rather than comfort. Samuel slowed his horse before reaching it, scanning the surrounding brush and the shallow draw behind the structure, confirming what he already expected but never assumed. No tracks that did not belong. No movement that suggested company. Only the steady quiet of a place that had been left alone long enough to feel settled. He dismounted with care, the stiffness in his side pulling at him as his boots hit the dirt, and tied his horse to the worn post near the door, his movements deliberate and economical. He did not look back immediately, but he felt Nalin stop behind him, her presence registering in the way the air seemed to hold still for a moment longer than usual. This place was his only fixed point in a life built on movement, and allowing another person to see it carried more weight than the fight at the water ever had. Samuel opened the door and stepped aside, leaving it wide rather than gesturing her forward, then moved inside without waiting. The interior was dim and cool, the light coming through the single window, catching dust in the air, the smell of wood, leather, and old smoke familiar and grounding. He set his pack down near the table, then paused, listening. After several seconds, he heard her step across the threshold. Nalin entered without hesitation, but not without caution, her eyes moving immediately through the room, marking exits, corners, and objects with quiet precision. She did not touch anything at first. She stood near the wall, her posture upright, her hands still, as if waiting for the space itself to declare its intent. Samuel turned his attention to practical matters, retrieving a bowl, water, and clean cloth from the shelf, laying them out on the table in plain view without explanation. He removed his coat slowly, the motion drawing a sharp pull from his side that he did not try to hide, and sat down, leaning forward as he began to clean the cut near his eye. His hand shook slightly, not from fear but from delayed strain, and before he could finish, Nalin stepped closer. She stopped when he looked up, her expression neutral, then waited. Samuel hesitated only a moment before nodding once. She took the cloth from his hand, her movements careful and practiced, applying pressure where needed, adjusting without causing unnecessary pain. She worked efficiently, not lingering, not avoiding contact, and when she was finished, she stepped back to her previous position without comment. Samuel felt an unexpected release of tension, not relief, but the recognition that he had allowed something without losing control. As evening approached, he prepared a simple meal, placing a portion on the table and another near the door, creating space rather than instruction. She chose the seat opposite him, keeping distance but sharing the same surface, and ate quietly, her attention focused on the food rather than the man across from her. The silence was not strained. It was careful. When night settled in, Samuel unrolled his bedroll near the door and left the bed untouched, a decision made without explanation. Nalin observed the choice, then moved to the bed, sitting on its edge before lying down fully dressed, her body positioned so she could see the room without turning. Samuel lay back, staring at the ceiling, aware of the unfamiliar weight of another presence sharing the space. Sleep came unevenly. He woke more than once, listening, assessing, and each time he registered the steady sound of her breathing, controlled and light. By morning, when the pale light crept through the window, Samuel understood that the cabin had changed without being altered. It was still his shelter, but it was no longer occupied by one purpose alone, and whatever followed would be shaped here, not on the open ground where choices could be delayed by distance. Morning established itself without ceremony, light entering the cabin in a thin, angled band that revealed how little sound the place carried when two people moved carefully inside it. Samuel woke first, not because he slept lightly, but because habit refused to loosen its hold even after a night that had demanded alertness rather than rest. His body registered the previous day in a series of dull signals. Tightness along his ribs, soreness in his hands, the faint sting near his eye, but none of it rose to the level of complaint. Pain, to him, was information, not an obstacle. He rose slowly and dressed without noise, aware of her presence without turning his head, and stepped outside to check the sky, the wind, and the line of ground he could see from the doorway. The weather was stable, the air dry, the kind that allowed planning without forcing it. He tended to his horse, refilled the water basin, and returned to the cabin carrying kindling he had gathered the evening before. Nalin was awake when he stepped back inside, sitting upright on the bed, her hair loose down her back, her posture already aligned with the day ahead. She did not startle or acknowledge him immediately. Instead, she finished adjusting the strap on her moccasin, then stood and moved toward the table, as if the transition from rest to work required no negotiation. Samuel noticed she waited until he had crossed the room before moving past him, a small adjustment that showed awareness rather than submission. He prepared breakfast with efficiency rather than care, heating what remained from the night before, portioning it without calculation. As he worked, he became aware that she was not watching him but the process, noting how he handled tools, where he placed items when finished, how he conserved motion. When he reached for the salt, he realized it was no longer where he remembered leaving it. He paused, scanned the shelf, then found it within easy reach, position where it could be accessed without turning. He did not comment. She did not look up. After the meal, Samuel set about the work he had postponed since returning, checking the fence line near the eastern slope and reinforcing a section that had taken damage from wind weeks earlier. He gestured toward the door and then toward the tool rack, indicating his intention without instruction. Nalin followed him outside, her eyes already adjusting to distance and light, her pace matching his without effort. She did not hover. She did not ask questions. Instead, she watched his methods, then selected tasks that complemented rather than duplicated his work. Where he focused on strength and placement, she attended to stability, packing soil, aligning stones, identifying where erosion would worsen if ignored. At one point, she pointed to a section of ground he had not planned to address, then knelt and demonstrated how water would move through it after the next rain. Samuel considered the indication, tested the soil with his boot, and altered his plan without argument. As the hours passed, their coordination improved without discussion. He handed her tools without thinking. She returned them cleaned and placed where they would be needed next. At midday, when the sun rose high enough to drain energy quickly, she disappeared briefly and returned with water she had cooled in shade, offering it without ceremony. He accepted it with a nod, understanding that refusal would create imbalance rather than autonomy. Later, as they worked near the edge of the property, Samuel became aware of movement in the distance. Two riders passing along a faint trail that cut across open ground well beyond his fence. His posture changed immediately, not in a threat but readiness. He shifted positions subtly, placing himself where he could see both the riders and the cabin without drawing attention. Nalin noticed the change before he spoke. She moved back toward the cabin at a controlled pace, not hiding, not lingering, positioning herself where she could observe without being exposed. The riders did not alter their course. They passed without slowing, unaware or uninterested, and when they were gone, Samuel released the tension in his shoulders and resumed work. Nalin returned to her task, as if the interruption had been expected, her movements steady, her expression unchanged. The moment passed without comment, but it left a mark. They had responded as a unit without planning, and the efficiency of it stayed with him. That evening, as the lights softened and the work slowed, Nalin took on a task Samuel had neglected for years, reorganizing the small storage area inside the cabin. She did not discard anything. She adjusted. Tools were grouped by function rather than habit. Supplies were rotated so older items would be used first. The changes were subtle but effective, and when Samuel noticed, he did not feel displaced. He felt supported in a way that did not ask for recognition. As darkness settled, she placed a small object near the hearth, a carved piece of wood marked with a simple pattern, and stepped back. Samuel asked, through gesture and expression rather than words, what it meant. She explained with limited language and clear intent that it marked shared space, a sign used to indicate that a place was under care, not claim. He absorbed the explanation slowly, then left it where she had placed it. That night, they ate at the same table, closer than before, not because distance had closed, but because it no longer needed enforcement. Conversation remained minimal, but it was no longer absent. A few exchanged words passed between them, functional and clear, enough to establish rhythm without pushing understanding faster than it could hold. When Samuel lay down near the door again, he did so knowing the choice had been observed and accepted. Nalin slept without tension, her breathing deeper than the night before. And as he listened to the sound of it filling the cabin, Samuel understood that the day had shifted something important. Not ownership, not obligation, responsibility, shared through action, reinforced by restraint, and beginning to take shape in ways he could no longer dismiss as temporary. The first real cold arrived before dawn, not as a storm, but as a steady drop that crept into the cabin through the seams Samuel had ignored for years, and he noticed it the moment he woke because the fire had burned down faster than usual. The air inside felt thinner, sharper, carrying a warning that the season had begun to turn whether he was prepared for it or not. He rose quietly, added wood, and watched the flame catch, aware that the decisions he made in the coming days would determine whether this place could support more than one person through the months ahead. Nalin was already awake when the fire brightened, sitting near the table with a strip of leather stretched between her hands, repairing a tear in her moccasin with movements so practiced they appeared automatic. She did not look up immediately. She finished the stitch, tested it with her thumb, then met his eyes briefly, acknowledging the morning without ceremony. Samuel noted that she had begun each day this way since arriving, not waiting for instruction or permission, but placing herself into the work as if the question of whether she belonged here had already been set aside in favor of what needed doing. They spent the early hours preparing for the change in weather. Samuel checked the roof supports and replaced a warped board along the back wall, while Nalin gathered plant from the lower ground that would no longer be usable once frost settled fully. She returned with her hands stained from sap and earth, laid the bundles out to dry, and explained through short phrases and gesture which would be used for food, which for treatment, and which only if nothing else remained. Samuel listened closely, repeating the names she offered until she corrected his pronunciation with a small shake of her head and a patient repetition. The exchange carried no humor, no frustration, only focus. As the day progressed, Samuel felt the need to address what had remained unspoken since the waterhole, not because tension had grown, but because clarity mattered before winter removed easy exits. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until they sat opposite each other with warm food between them, the cabin quiet except for the sound of the fire, settling into its rhythm. He spoke plainly, explaining that he did not recognize any law that would give him claim over her, that whatever custom had followed the fight did not obligate her to stay, and that if she wished to leave once conditions allowed, he would not prevent it. Nalin listened without interruption, her expression attentive but guarded, and when he finished, she responded slowly, selecting her words with care. She explained the custom as she understood it, not as ownership, but as responsibility placed on the man left standing, a way to prevent a woman from being cast adrift after loss. She stated clearly that returning alone to her people was no longer possible, not because she was unwanted, but because circumstances had shifted beyond reversal. Staying with him was not surrender. It was survival. Samuel absorbed this in silence, feeling the weight of her explanation settle alongside his own sense of obligation. He clarified that survival here would mean work, shared risk, and decisions made together rather than imposed, and that comfort was not guaranteed. Nalin accepted these conditions without hesitation. She then stated, simply and firmly, that she would remain through the winter. The words carried finality without promise, a decision framed by reality rather than emotion. From that point forward, their days took on a new structure. Tasks were no longer divided by assumption, but discussed briefly and adjusted as needed. Samuel showed her where he stored grain and how he tracked consumption to ensure it lasted. She demonstrated methods of stretching meals without reducing strength, combining dried plants with preserved meat in ways he had not considered. Each exchange introduced knowledge the other lacked, and neither treated the learning as a concession. In the evenings, Samuel practiced her language by naming objects in the cabin, repeating them until his mouth shaped the sounds correctly. She corrected him when necessary and ignored mistakes that did not matter. In return, she asked him the names he used for landmarks beyond the property, mapping his understanding of the land against her own. The process revealed differences without creating conflict, and the cabin became a place where two ways of seeing the same ground could exist without canceling each other out. As the week ended, Samuel made a decision he had delayed since her arrival. He moved his bedroll closer to the wall and cleared space near the hearth, not for her to sleep, but to store additional blankets within easy reach. The change was small but deliberate. Nolan noticed it immediately. She did not comment, but later that night, she placed one of the blankets back after he had finished adjusting it, aligning it carefully as if acknowledging the intent behind the action rather than the object itself. When darkness settled fully and the wind pressed against the cabin, Samuel lay awake longer than usual, listening to the fire and the controlled sound of Nalin's breathing from the other side of the room. He did not feel trapped. He did not feel rescued. He felt the steady pressure of responsibility made mutual, a shift that carried weight but not fear. Whatever had begun in violence was now being reshaped by choice, measured one day at a time, with winter approaching and no room left for uncertainty disguised as distance. Snow did not arrive all at once. It began as a light fall during the night, fine enough that Samuel only noticed it when the silence outside deepened beyond its usual level, the kind of quiet that pressed inward rather than settling around the cabin. When he stepped outside before dawn, the ground held a thin, uneven layer that reflected the first gray light, and the air carried a sharpness that made breathing deliberate. Winter had crossed the line from possibility into fact. He adjusted his plans immediately. There was no sense in waiting for conditions to dictate terms when preparation could still shape outcomes. Samuel fed the horse, reinforced the latch on the storage shed, and checked the stack of firewood, counting without moving pieces, his mind running through estimates with practiced efficiency. Every calculation now had to account for two people, not in theory, but in daily use, and the responsibility felt heavier without feeling unfamiliar. Nalin joined him outside shortly after sunrise, wrapped in a heavier layer she had repaired the night before, her movements unhurried but purposeful. She surveyed the sky, the slope of the land, the way snow had gathered unevenly against rock and brush, and pointed toward the higher ground behind the cabin, explaining through simple phrases and gesture how drifts would form there once the wind shifted. Samuel listened closely, revising his own assumptions as she spoke. He had lived here long enough to understand patterns, but she read change with a different attention, one that focused on what the land would do rather than what it had done before. They spent the morning reinforcing weak points. Samuel worked on the exterior, sealing gaps along the base of the cabin and adding weight to the roof supports where older joints had begun to loosen. Nalin remained inside, adjusting the interior to conserve heat, moving stored items away from draft-prone walls and reorganizing the sleeping area to retain warmth without crowding. When she brought him water, it was warmed, not hot, a choice that preserved body heat without draining energy. He noticed the detail and stored it away without comment. By midday, the snow thickened, falling faster, heavier, and Samuel made the call to remain close to the cabin rather than pushing through additional tasks that could wait. He relayed the decision with a brief motion toward the door and a single word. Nalin agreed without debate, shifting her focus to preparation rather than expansion. They worked side by side inside, grinding dried roots into powder, checking seams in clothing, and testing the balance of stored supplies so nothing remained unused simply because it had been placed out of reach. As the storm intensified, the world outside narrowed to visibility measured in yards rather than distance, and the cabin became the center of every calculation. The fire demanded constant attention, and they took turns feeding it, each aware of how quickly fatigue could set in if vigilance slipped. At one point, a gust rattled the roof hard enough to send a vibration through the walls, and Samuel paused, listening for structural failure. When none followed, he resumed his task without outward reaction, though the tension remained. Nalin moved with quiet assurance through the confined space, never blocking paths, never interrupting motion. She began speaking more frequently, not in long explanations, but in short, necessary exchanges, warnings about draft shifts, reminders about timing, observations about the fire's behavior. Samuel responded in kind, the communication efficient, stripped of anything unnecessary. They were no longer working around each other. They were working as part of the same system. Night arrived early, the storm showing no sign of easing, and they prepared for the possibility that it would last through morning. Samuel secured the door with an additional brace, then sat back, evaluating the room with a critical eye that missed nothing. Nalin placed a small container near the hearth, explaining it held a mixture to ease breathing if the smoke thickened. He accepted the explanation and adjusted the airflow accordingly, trusting her judgment without needing proof. As the hours passed, the rhythm inside the cabin steadied. The fire held. The roof remained firm. Outside, the wind pressed and withdrew in cycles that tested patience rather than endurance. At one point, Samuel's focus faltered, his body demanding rest he could not yet allow, and Nalin noticed before he spoke. She gestured for him to sit, took over tending the fire without waiting for consent, and continued the task with the same care he would have applied. The transfer carried no challenge. It was necessity acknowledged. Later, when the worst of the storm had passed, they sat near the fire without speaking, sharing the same warmth without leaning into it. Samuel became aware of a shift he could not tie to a single action. The cabin no longer felt like a place he was defending from intrusion. It felt like a space under shared care, each decision reinforced by the other's presence rather than threatened by it. Before sleeping, Nalin adjusted the placement of their bedrolls, angling them to block drafts while maintaining space, a solution that balanced closeness with autonomy. Samuel observed the arrangement, recognized the intent, and did not alter it. He lay back, listening to the storm's remnants move across the basin. And for the first time since the waterhole, his thoughts did not return to the violence that had brought them together. What occupied his mind instead was the knowledge that winter had arrived and found them prepared, not because of strength alone, but because two people had chosen to respond to pressure with cooperation rather than withdrawal. The understanding did not require naming. It settled quietly, like the snow outside, reshaping the ground beneath it without demanding attention. The thaw came unevenly, not as relief, but as complication, and Samuel noticed it first in the way the ground refused to behave predictably underfoot. Snow retreated in patches, leaving exposed earth slick and unstable, while shaded areas held firm, forcing adjustments with every step outside the cabin. He adapted his routines without comment, altering paths, delaying tasks that relied on stable footing, and revising plans that had been built for colder certainty. The season had shifted again, and with it came a different set of demands. Nalin responded to the change with the same measured attention she had given the storm weeks earlier. She marked where meltwater pooled and redirected runoff away from the cabin's base using shallow channels cut with a short-handled tool she had shaped herself from scrap. Samuel watched her work without interrupting, recognizing the efficiency of the method and the foresight behind it. When he joined her, they coordinated movements instinctively, each taking responsibility for sections that matched their strengths without needing to discuss it first. As conditions improved, Samuel expanded his focus beyond maintenance and into preparation for movement and trade. Supplies had held through winter, but replenishment would be necessary before isolation became choice rather than circumstance. He began sorting items suitable for exchange, setting aside cured hides, preserved meat, and a small quantity of dried herbs he had gathered under Nalin's guidance. The process carried weight, because leaving the property meant exposure, questions, and potential conflict, all of which had been absent for months. He addressed the matter directly one evening as they sat at the table, the fire low but steady. He explained the need to make contact, to secure additional tools and seed, and to reestablish a presence beyond the basin before rumors filled the gap. His voice remained even, his posture open, and he made it clear that the decision affected both of them. He did not assume her participation. He asked for it. Nalin listened carefully, her attention fixed on the details rather than the implication of travel itself. She asked specific questions about distance, timing, and the nature of the people he expected to encounter. Samuel answered without minimizing risk, outlining where he would go, how long he would be gone if he traveled alone, and what arrangements he would make if she chose to stay behind. The clarity mattered. It placed agency where it belonged. She responded after a long pause, stating that she would go with him, not as protection and not as obligation, but because visibility reduced danger more effectively than absence. She explained that being seen together, working in coordination, established boundaries others were less likely to test. Samuel accepted the reasoning without hesitation. It aligned with his own experience, even if he had avoided acknowledging it. In preparation, they reviewed every detail that could be controlled. Nalin adjusted their clothing for travel, reinforcing seams and redistributing weight so movement would remain efficient over long distances. Samuel selected routes that balanced exposure with speed, avoiding places where attention gathered unnecessarily. They rehearsed responses to likely questions, keeping explanations brief and factual, agreeing on what would be shared and what would remain unspoken. Before leaving, Samuel made a decision he had been considering since winter ended. He carved a new post for the edge of the property, taller and more visible than the markers he used for fencing, and asked Nalin to choose where it would stand. She selected a point near the path that led away from the cabin, a place visible to anyone approaching but not dominating the land itself. Together, they set it firmly, ensuring it would hold through wind and weather. Samuel carved both their names into the wood, equal in size and depth, not as claim, but as record. He did not announce the act or explain it beyond stating that it would simplify matters with outsiders. Nalin observed the carving closely, then nodded once, accepting the purpose without treating it as ceremony. The post stood as a practical solution to a practical concern, and its meaning did not require embellishment. The journey that followed tested their preparation rather than their resolve. They moved steadily, covering ground without drawing attention, managing interactions with others through brevity and consistency. Samuel handled negotiations when required. Nalin observed, intervening only when clarification improved outcomes. Together, they secured what they needed and returned without incident, their presence registered but not challenged. When they reached the cabin again, the sense of return carried a different quality than before. The place no longer felt provisional. It functioned as a point of origin and destination, shaped by decisions that extended beyond immediate survival. Samuel recognized the shift without attaching sentiment to it. The evidence was practical, supplies replenished, plans extended, risks reduced. That night, as they sat near the fire, Nalin spoke of the future in terms of continuity rather than hope, outlining what the next seasons would require and how they could meet those needs without overextension. Samuel listened, contributing where his experience applied, and together they shaped a framework that did not depend on tradition or assumption. It depended on agreement. When they lay down to sleep, the arrangement reflected that understanding. Space was shared without tension. Silence carried purpose rather than distance. The path ahead was defined not by the past that had forced them together, but by the decisions they continued to make in alignment, each step reinforcing that what had begun as obligation had become partnership through deliberate, sustained choice. Time changed its shape once spring gave way to early summer, stretching days longer without making them easier, and Samuel noticed the difference not in comfort but in expectation. Work no longer centered on repair or preparation alone. It moved toward continuity. The land demanded planning now, not reaction, and each decision carried implications that reached beyond the next week or the next storm. He approached the shift with the same restraint that guided everything else in his life, careful not to mistake stability for certainty. The first indication that their situation had settled into something durable came through routine rather than discussion. Mornings began with shared tasks divided without words. Samuel took responsibility for the outer work, livestock perimeter checks, heavy lifting, while Nalin focused on cultivation, preservation, and organization, though the boundaries between their efforts remained flexible. When one task required two sets of hands, neither hesitated. When independence made more sense, it was respected. The rhythm that developed was not efficient because it was planned, but because it was adjusted daily. They expanded the small garden behind the cabin, breaking new ground where soil allowed, choosing crops that matured at different rates to reduce risk. Nalin guided the process with practical knowledge, explaining spacing, timing, and soil treatment through demonstration rather than instruction. Samuel followed her lead without resistance, recognizing that expertise did not challenge authority when authority was not the goal. He contributed labor and logistical planning, ensuring water access remained reliable even during dry spells, rerouting a narrow channel from higher ground to maintain flow without overuse. As the weeks passed, their conversations increased in frequency, but not in length. Exchanges stayed focused, grounded in immediate needs and long-term implications. When disagreements arose, they were addressed directly and resolved through trial rather than debate. If an approach failed, it was adjusted without assigning fault. The absence of accusation allowed progress to continue without resentment, and both understood that the system only worked if neither treated compromise as loss. Physical closeness evolved without announcement. It emerged in practical moments: a hand steadying another during a difficult task, shared space near the fire after long days, quiet presence during rest. When they crossed that boundary fully, it happened without ceremony, without urgency, and without any sense of obligation carried over from the past. Consent was implicit in restraint as much as in action. What followed was not possession or reassurance, but a deepened awareness of shared vulnerability and shared choice. Samuel noticed the internal shift slowly. He no longer evaluated each day by how much distance it placed between him and his former life. Instead, he measured progress by continuity, by whether tomorrow's plans built naturally on today's work. The guilt he carried from his military years did not disappear, but it loosened its grip, no longer shaping his decisions through avoidance. He found himself considering the future without bracing for its collapse, a change subtle enough to be overlooked but significant enough to alter behavior. Nalin, in turn, displayed signs of rootedness that did not resemble surrender. She expanded her involvement beyond immediate survival, proposing improvements to storage, suggesting seasonal adjustments, and initiating conversations about trade relationships that could be maintained without exposure. She spoke of the land as something to be managed rather than endured, and Samuel recognized that the perspective marked a transition from temporary refuge to chosen place. One afternoon, as they worked near the edge of the property, Samuel paused to watch her for reasons he could not immediately define. Her movements carried confidence without tension, efficiency without haste. She was not performing a role assigned by custom or circumstance. She was acting from ownership of her own choices. The realization brought with it a sense of responsibility that felt earned rather than imposed. That evening, they revisited the topic of formal recognition, not as an abstract concept, but as a practical measure. Samuel explained the benefits in clear terms: legal standing, protection against claims, reduced scrutiny during trade. Nalin listened and then reframed the issue, stating that recognition mattered less for legitimacy than for clarity. She wanted assurance that whatever form the arrangement took, it would reflect partnership rather than substitution, that her identity would not be absorbed into his by default. Samuel responded without hesitation, agreeing to terms that emphasized mutual consent and shared authority. They discussed specifics late into the night, addressing potential complications and resolving them before they could take shape. The process was deliberate, stripped of symbolism, and grounded in function. When they finished, there was no need to restate the outcome. It was already understood. The following days reinforced the decision through action rather than declaration. Samuel adjusted records and markers to reflect shared responsibility. Nalin integrated her own systems into his without displacing either. The cabin, the land, and the work surrounding it all bore evidence of dual stewardship, visible in details that outsiders might overlook but insiders could not miss. As summer progressed, they hosted visitors more frequently, not as guests but as necessary contacts. Samuel handled initial exchanges. Nalin observed patterns and offered insight afterward, identifying risks and opportunities Samuel might have dismissed. Their coordination during these interactions was seamless, each reinforcing the other's presence without drawing attention to it. The effect was subtle but effective. Boundaries were respected without being enforced. Late one night, after a long day that had stretched their energy thin, they sat outside under a sky clear enough to reveal depth rather than beauty. Silence settled around them. Not heavy, not strained, simply present. Samuel spoke then, not about the past or the future, but about the present, about the reality that the life they were building required maintenance as much as creation. Nalin agreed, adding that staying was not a single decision, but a series of daily commitments, each one renewing the last. They sat with that understanding until fatigue set in, neither needing reassurance from the other. When they returned inside, the cabin received them without resistance. It had been shaped to fit two people without compressing either, and that balance reflected the choices that had brought them there. By the time summer reached its height, the question of whether they belonged together no longer required examination. The answer was visible in the structure of their days, the stability of their routines, and the absence of unresolved tension. What remained was not uncertainty, but responsibility freely accepted and consistently upheld, a foundation strong enough to carry them forward without demanding proof. The decision to formalize what already existed did not arrive with urgency or doubt. It emerged the way most of their choices had since winter, through accumulation. By late summer, the land around the cabin bore clear evidence of sustained care rather than temporary use. Fence lines held. Storage was balanced. Trade routes were established without drawing attention. Nothing about their life suggested improvisation anymore, and Samuel recognized that clarity, not passion, was what finally demanded resolution. He raised the matter one morning while they worked near the corral, his tone even, his attention fixed on the task at hand rather than her reaction. He explained that remaining undefined created vulnerability neither of them needed to carry, that the arrangements they already honored deserved recognition that would protect their work and their future. He spoke plainly, outlining what such a commitment would change and, more importantly, what it would not. There would be no transfer of authority, no erosion of autonomy, no reshaping of identity. Only permanence where uncertainty no longer served a purpose. Nalin did not answer immediately. She finished tying off the rope she was handling, tested the knot, then stood back and assessed the result before turning to him. Her response was measured and complete. She stated that she did not require validation through ceremony, but she understood the practical necessity of declaration. If they chose to mark their union, it would be done without spectacle, grounded in mutual acknowledgement rather than public approval. Samuel agreed without hesitation. The terms aligned with everything they had built. They selected a date not because it held significance, but because it allowed time to prepare without disruption. There was no invitation list, no announcement, only a plan to meet the requirements recognized by the nearest authority and return home the same day. The simplicity of it suited them both. Preparation unfolded quietly. Samuel gathered the necessary documents and supplies. Nalin adjusted their clothing, not to elevate appearance, but to ensure durability and respectability appropriate to the setting. On the morning they left, the cabin stood ready to receive them again, stocked, ordered, and untroubled by absence. The land did not feel abandoned. It felt held. The journey was uneventful, which they both recognized as confirmation rather than coincidence. The formalities were completed without complication. Questions were asked and answered directly. No assumptions were challenged because none had been allowed to take root. When the final acknowledgement was made, there was no applause, no pause, only the understanding that what had already been true now carried recognition that could not be ignored. They returned before nightfall. That evening, they shared a meal that differed from others only in awareness. Nothing had changed in their behavior. No roles shifted. No expectations were revised. The stability they had built remained intact, now reinforced rather than redefined. When they cleared the table, they did so together, the routine uninterrupted. As weeks passed, the effect of the decision revealed itself through ease rather than novelty. Interactions with others grew simpler. Boundaries required less explanation. Planning extended further forward without hesitation. The land responded as it always had, indifferent to names and records, but benefiting from continuity. Nalin took on a larger role in managing trade relationships, traveling occasionally without Samuel when it served efficiency. He supported the choice without reservation, adjusting his own responsibilities to accommodate absence without disruption. Their trust did not rely on proximity. It functioned through consistency. Samuel, for his part, allowed himself a degree of permanence he had denied for years. He invested in improvements that assumed long-term use rather than seasonal survival. He planned beyond necessity, not because he expected reward, but because the effort no longer felt wasted. The guilt that had once dictated restraint lost its authority, replaced by accountability grounded in the present rather than the past. Their home became known not for what it sheltered, but for what it produced: reliable exchange, fair dealings, quiet order. Visitors came and went without tension. No one questioned the arrangement because it required no defense. It functioned. One evening, as the light faded and the work of the day concluded, Samuel and Nalin sat outside, reviewing plans for the coming year. They spoke of expansion without excess, of maintaining balance without stagnation. The conversation carried no urgency, only intent. When it ended, there was nothing left unresolved. Later, inside the cabin, they prepared for rest with the same deliberate care that had defined their life together from the beginning. The space held them without adjustment. Everything they needed was present because they had built it that way. What had begun at a contested water source ended here, not in resolution of conflict, but in the steady assurance of belonging chosen rather than assigned. There was no lingering question about obligation or custom. The bond they shared existed because they maintained it daily through work, restraint, and mutual decision. They slept without tension, without anticipation, secure in the knowledge that the life they had shaped required no further justification. Peace did not arrive as a moment. It revealed itself through continuity, sustained and protected by two people who had chosen to stay.